Footsteps in the empty hallway. Part 1. The New Tenant. The day Sophie moved into Hollow Oaks Apartments, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. The landlord, Mr. Harlow, had assured her the building was perfectly normal, though his hurried tone suggested otherwise. "I'll leave you to settle in," he said, practically fleeing as Sophie wheeled her last suitcase into her unit. The apartment itself was unremarkable, a modest one-bedroom with creaky floors and outdated fixtures. Sophie didn't mind. After years of cramped dorm rooms and shared housing, she was thrilled to finally have her own space. That night, as she unpacked in the quiet solitude of her new home, Sophie noticed something odd. The hallway outside her door seemed unnaturally silent, almost as if it absorbed sound. She shrugged it off. Old buildings were full of quirks. It wasn't until she lay down to sleep that the silence was broken. At first it was faint, the soft tap, tap, tap of footsteps echoing down the hallway. Sophie sat up, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, heavier, as if someone were walking directly toward her door. She checked her phone. 12:47 a.m. Sophie waited for the sound of a knock or a voice, but none came. Just the steady rhythm of footsteps pacing back and forth. She crept to the peephole, her heart hammering. The hallway was empty. Puzzled, she opened the door and stepped out. "Hello?" she called into the dimly lit corridor. Silence. The air felt colder in the hallway, like stepping into a refrigerator. She shivered and closed the door quickly, locking it behind her. Back in bed, Sophie tried to convince herself it was just one of her neighbors. But as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, the footsteps began again. This time they stopped directly outside her door. And then came the whisper, a low, rasping voice that seeped through the cracks of her door. "Why are you here?" Part 2. The Whispering Voice. Sophie jolted upright, her breath caught in her throat. The whisper had been unmistakable, a rasping voice that sounded far too close for comfort. She stared at the door, her eyes wide, waiting for something. A knock? More footsteps? Nothing. Clutching her phone, she turned on the flashlight and shined it around the room, as if the light could dispel her fear. After a few moments of tense silence, she told herself it was a prank. Maybe one of her new neighbors thought it was funny to scare the new girl. The next morning, she asked around. Most of the tenants were either elderly or kept to themselves, barely sparing her more than a polite nod. When Sophie brought up the footsteps, an older man on the third floor frowned deeply. "You're in 206, right?" he asked, lowering his voice. "Yeah," Sophie replied cautiously. "Don't let it bother you," he said, but his tone suggested it wasn't advice he believed. "Some folks hear things in that hall. Just ignore it and it'll leave you alone." Sophie's stomach tightened. "What do you mean by it?" The man shook his head, avoiding her gaze. "This building's old. Things creak. Don't go looking for trouble." That night, Sophie found herself hyper-aware of every sound the building made. Pipes groaned, floorboards creaked, but the footsteps didn't return. At least, not at first. Around midnight, just as she was starting to relax, the pacing began again. This time, the footsteps were slower, heavier, each step echoing with a deliberate weight. She grabbed her phone, hit record, and crept toward the door. Her hand hovered over the peephole, but a sick sense of dread kept her from looking. Then the whisper came again. "You don't belong here." It wasn't just a voice. It felt like a presence, like something was leaning into the door, pressing against it. Sophie stumbled back, nearly dropping her phone. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but as she turned to grab her coat, she heard a new sound, a low thump on her door, as though something heavy had just hit it. With trembling hands, she dialed the landlord. The phone rang and rang, but Mr. Harlow didn't pick up. She left a shaky voicemail, asking for him to call her back immediately. The night dragged on in suffocating silence. The footsteps stopped, but Sophie didn't sleep. She sat on her couch, clutching her phone, jumping at every minor creak the apartment made. By the time dawn broke, her nerves were frayed. She decided she couldn't stay another night without answers. She headed to the building's small office, determined to confront Mr. Harlow. But when she arrived, she found the office door ajar, the lights flickering inside, and on the desk was a single, chilling message scrawled in black ink. "You should have left." Part 3. The Shadow's Warning. Sophie stared at the words on the desk, her pulse pounding in her ears. The crude scrawl looked hastily written, the letters jagged and uneven. Her mind raced. Was this someone's idea of a sick joke, or was it something worse? The room felt wrong, like it was watching her. Every instinct told her to leave, but she couldn't tear herself away. She searched the small office for any sign of Mr. Harlow, but it was deserted. His coat hung on a hook by the door, and his keys were still on the desk. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. A faint creak came from the hallway behind her. Sophie froze. She hadn't heard anyone enter. Slowly, she turned and peered into the dimly lit corridor. It was empty, or so it seemed at first glance, but as her eyes adjusted, she noticed a faint, shifting shadow near the end of the hallway, where the overhead light flickered erratically. The shadow wasn't attached to anything. It moved like it had weight, dragging itself along the wall in slow, deliberate motions. As Sophie watched in paralyzed horror, it stretched unnaturally, elongating toward her. The footsteps began again. Tap, tap, tap. They were louder than before, each step resonating like a hammer on wood. Sophie backed into the office, her hands fumbling for something, anything, to defend herself. She grabbed a heavy stapler from the desk, clutching it tightly as if it would make a difference. The shadow stopped just outside the office door. For a moment, the footsteps ceased, replaced by a heavy, unnatural silence. Sophie held her breath, her heart racing so fast she thought it might burst. Then came the whisper, low and guttural, as if spoken through a throat choked with earth. "You don't see it yet, but you will." The shadow vanished, dissolving into the air like smoke. Sophie didn't wait to see what came next. She bolted out of the office and ran back to her apartment, slamming the door behind her. She pressed her back against it, struggling to catch her breath. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She fumbled to answer it, seeing an unknown number on the screen. "Hello?" she stammered. The voice on the other end was distorted, crackling with static. "You're not safe," it said, cutting out before Sophie could respond. Her phone went dead, the battery inexplicably drained. And then from the hallway outside came the sound of footsteps again, only this time they didn't stop at her door. They kept going, moving deeper into the building, toward the upper floors. She realized with a sinking dread that whatever was haunting her wasn't just in the hallway anymore. It was in the building. Part 4. The Final Revelation. Sophie's heart pounded as the footsteps faded into the upper floors, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. She wanted to flee, to run out into the street and never look back. But something stopped her. The words from the distorted voice echoed in her mind. "You're not safe." Gathering what little courage she had left, Sophie grabbed a flashlight, her phone charger, and a jacket. She decided to follow the footsteps. She needed answers, no matter how terrifying they might be. The stairwell smelled of dust and damp concrete. Each step she climbed seemed heavier than the last, the air growing colder and thicker as she ascended. By the time she reached the 4th floor, she could see her breath in the air. The hallway on this floor was darker, the overhead lights flickering erratically. The carpet was damp, as though soaked through by something unseen. And then she noticed it, a trail of muddy footprints leading to the last door on the right. The door to apartment 406. The same door she'd heard the footsteps pacing toward on the first night. Sophie approached cautiously, her flashlight trembling in her grip. The door was slightly ajar, revealing only darkness inside. She pushed it open, the hinges groaning like a wounded animal. Inside, the air was freezing and the stench of decay was overwhelming. The room was empty, no furniture, no signs of life, except for one thing. In the center of the room was a hole in the floor, a perfect circle carved into the wood, leading into blackness. Around the edges of the hole, strange symbols were etched into the floor, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. And then she heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. The footsteps echoed from the hole, growing louder with each step, as if something was climbing up. Sophie backed away, her flashlight beam shaking as it struggled to pierce the oppressive darkness. A hand emerged first. It was skeletal and clawed, the flesh stretched tight over bone. Then came a face, hollow-eyed and twisted with malice. Its grin was bad and unnatural, revealing jagged, broken teeth. Sophie screamed and stumbled backward, but the creature's raspy voice stopped her cold. "You opened the door. Now you'll never leave." The room seemed to shift, the walls twisting and warping as shadows poured out of the hole, surrounding her. Sophie tried to run, but the shadows were faster, pulling her toward the gaping abyss. She clawed at the floor, her screams swallowed by the void. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the landlord, Mr. Harlow, standing in the doorway, his face pale and expressionless. "I told you not to stay," he murmured. "It needs someone. And now it has you." The door to apartment 406 slammed shut, and in the hallway the footsteps began again.